Hi, welcome to this week's lecture. We are talking about the response of the working class to the disruptions that we saw last week. As you recall, there is a strong sense among American workers that they have ownership in their government, that it is their republic, that they are the backbone of that republic, and that it was their labor and their effort in fighting the British twice that got the country its independence. And in the 1830s, starting really in the 1820s, they get a growing sense that it's not their country anymore, that the rich and powerful are monopolizing its institutions and are making laws to benefit them at the expense of others. And there are plenty of laws, and we'll discuss this when we talk about the labor organizations in New York, that are highly one-sided. For instance, debt imprisonment, that you can go to prison if you went to the grocery store and said, I'll pay you back on Monday, I don't have the money, I didn't get that much work this week. And if you don't pay back on Monday, you have to go to prison because you owe money and you went back on a contract. You violated a contract between you and the grocer. And now rather than making money to pay back, there is no such thing as an orderly default. You can't just pay somebody back over time. You're going to be sitting in prison, you'll not be making any money, and your family is also going to lose its main breadwinner, meaning that most likely your children end up joining the ranks of those who hang out at the theater and join gangs and engage in petty crime. The good news is that the American working class is not taking this lying down. The organizations that they form to fight for their rights, for full citizenship, for having a stake and a say in the institutions of the country, economically and politically, is heroic. We'll see how far it gets them, but one thing is for sure, the organizations, be it unions or political parties, that the working class form, leave an impact on the political system. So I want to go over the lecture that discusses that political system, but keep in mind that underlying it all is still that march from the traditional order to a capitalist one, which at this point is near complete. At the very least, that march is highly accelerated. Although, of course, there are many parts of the country that are still dominated by subsistence farming, the cities are now essentially characterized by capitalist wage-labor relations, commodity production, and so on. So I am going to, hold on a second here. All right, and we're back. Here is the lecture about democracy and mass membership political parties. Mass membership political parties, what did we have in the early republic, if not that? And what happened to change that? Well, two main things happened during this time period. One is that voting rights are expanded, and the other is that parties and elected officials become accountable to voters, whereas they hadn't been before. Before 1810, parties were mostly made up of local notables, which is to say the mayor, the minister, the judge, the sheriff, and so forth, the rich people, the largest landowners, and a small group of people, sometimes referred to as the courthouse clique, people who set policy, people who run the show. These were the people who made up parties. After 1820, it's mostly professional politicians, people whose livelihood is politics and who do that, who devote their lives to representing their voters and running the country. The membership of these parties go from essentially only the people who get elected. Once they get into Congress or into the State House, that's when they declare themselves, I will be joining the Democratic Republicans, I'll be joining the Federalists. So the legislative caucus, the group of people who belong to the party in the Congress, that's the party. very small group, self-selecting group of people. After 1820, increasingly, you have disciplined mass membership. People without any office, people without any other ties to the government join the party so that they can have a voice in selecting candidates for office, for leadership positions, voting on demands and programs and all that. And parties, in fact, become an important part of social life. People go to the club of your local Democratic or Republican Party to see their friends. That's what you do for fun. And the activities around election time, the rallies, the meet and greet of the politicians and the candidates, that becomes part of what people do and what comes to define their identity. The interesting thing, however, because this is such a radical change that parties come to be the possession of the people, the content doesn't really change that much. If you remember the 1790s, the main divide between Jefferson's Democratic Republicans and Hamilton's Federalists was that Hamilton wanted to expand the government to make it into a tool for expanding capitalism, create a capitalist financial system, and then hopefully get large-scale industrialization and infrastructure improvement financed with the help of that financial system to transform society into one where people mostly work for wages rather than as independent producers of commodities, be they agricultural or manufactured. And Jefferson had the opposite vision. He also wanted a capitalist society, but without much banking, much power in the hands of merchants and factory owners, and a limited government, with the understanding he had that the only reason you need a big government is to foster capitalist development. So if you don't want that, there is no need for a big government. The underlying values, of course, of Jefferson of equality and democracy, which were not really shared by Hamilton, who simply didn't think that the people should be considered equal to their social betters and therefore shouldn't have a say if you can avoid it. So this is a continuity. There are parties now, one Hamiltonian, or there will be after 1840, one Hamiltonian, one Jeffersonian. So that's a major, a major continuity here. The important factor that made possible the transformation of the structure of parties was that voting rights were expanded in the 1820s. If you remember John Adams, he said, you can't have men who own no property, significant amounts of property, vote, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't have the responsibility and the respectability and the interest in the common good. So they'll mess it up for everybody if you give the property list to vote. And that excludes, let's say at least 85% of the white male adult population from the right to vote off the bat. And this is the group that now gets the right to vote. On the flip side, and this is revolutionary because it means that there is no longer the main qualification that there had been to exclude people from the right to vote, property, that is dropped. Unfortunately, because property used to be largely in the hands of white adult men, there really hadn't been a need to define that it was just about white people and just about men. For that reason, that was never put down in the law. So in places, women who ended up inheriting wealth and had no male relatives who could claim it, and African Americans who had built businesses as free people after the end of slavery in the North, went and voted, and nobody kept them from it because they had the property. So when the states changed their constitutions to say all adult citizens above the age of 21 can vote, no matter whether they have property, they made sure to put in there, but if they're not men and if they're not white, then they don't get to vote. So it's a mixed bag, as you can see, because on the one hand, property qualifications are abolished, so the population that can vote expands at least 10 times. But on the qualifications that are about gender and race, these are now made official and they hadn't been. The people who get the right to vote also have a bigger slate of offices to vote for. Out of colonial times, most officials were not elected by the people, but appointed by the governor or by the mayor. Sheriffs, judges, the mayor themselves often were elected by the city council, not by the citizens. And important for the federal level is that presidential electors, if you look at the Constitution, the people per state who go and become the electoral college and then vote for president are elected in a manner determined by the state legislature. And the state legislatures had read that to mean that it is them that get to select the electors directly without having to ask the people. And that started to change first in the 18-teens in New York, where the population got to vote for presidential electors to sit in the electoral college. And by 1828, every state, with the exception of South Carolina, had given the people, the voting population, the right to elect the electors. South Carolina started doing it in 1860 to give the people a chance to vote against Abraham Lincoln. So for an overview of this development and what the introduction of the white adult working class to the political system as voters did to the party system, let's look at the timeline. Between 1790 and 1815, you had two parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, that fell along the divide of Jefferson versus Hamilton. Adams's Federalist Party was Hamiltonian, because Hamilton himself died in 1800. After 1815, the Federalist Party collapsed. And after 1816, that meant there was one party left standing, the Democratic Republicans. That is why people refer to that era, these 8 years, as the era of good feelings, because it was a one-party system with democratic elections without any obvious disagreement. Everybody belonged to the same party. Many policies that the Federalists had wanted, like a national bank, had been picked up by the Democratic Republicans. So it appeared to be a republic like from the textbook. But the founders had thought, you wouldn't have parties. Why would you have parties? Because all citizens in a republic have equal rights. Where would there be a source for conflict that would even justify having different parties? And just as if to underscore that vision of social and political harmony, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died simultaneously on July 4th, 1826. And if you're paying attention, you might have noticed that this is 50 years to the date after both of them signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. So this is the 50th anniversary of the Republic. Adams and Jefferson were both involved in creating it. They had a major falling out in the 1790s. Adams and his supporters went so far as to want to lock Jefferson up for the audacity of running for president against Adams in 1800. But after Abigail Adams died in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson had written a letter to John Adams to send his condolences. And Adams had responded with a long letter of his own. And Jefferson had replied to that. And before you knew it, the two of them, who never met again, were friends, exchanging letters that were personal, but also that reflected on what had come of the Republic, what it's like to be president, an experience that not many people share. So posthumously, after their deaths, this exchange of letters became an important part of the body of work that defines political writing and political science in this country. So when they both died on the same day, it seemed like this is another sign that the divisions of the very early Republic have been put aside, and we now are all working on the same goal. Adams died a few hours before Thomas Jefferson. Excuse me, was the other one. Jefferson died a few hours before Adams in Monticello in Virginia. And when Adams died later that day, and without any telecommunication, he didn't know that Jefferson had just died. So Adams died with the words, "Jefferson survives." And that too became part of this legend. Yet, the notion that this was an era of good feelings belies the social conflict that is running underneath. As wage labor, factory production, capitalist relations proliferate in society, people become restless. There's lots of discontent that is not reflected in the party system. So rather than actually reflect harmony in society, the party system was grossly out of touch with reality. So in the 1820s, up to 1832, you get a realignment. Everybody at that point is still a democratic Republican, but several of that party are now running against each other. Only in 1832 does a new two-party system take shape, with Democrats under Andrew Jackson as heirs of Jefferson, and the Whigs under Henry Clay and Daniel Webster as heirs to the Federalists. So we already talked about the 1790s and about how the parties represented local notables, the important people in the town. And one implication of this is that there wasn't really much competition for the vote on the local level. I mean, not that many people could vote, hardly any more than were already members of that courthouse clique. And when the mayor and the judge and the minister decided this person is going to be in Congress to represent us, the rest of the voters went along. So rarely did you get competitive local elections. But during the era of good feelings, when many more people wanted to run for office, and all of them wanted to run under the label of the one remaining party as Democratic Republicans, suddenly you had unprincipled competition. All people who all wanted the same thing, but nonetheless had a personal rivalry over who gets to represent the district. One factor is, of course, that in 1800, you probably had one big city in a congressional district, or even just one small town. So the people who run that town can run the district. By 1820, you're much more likely to have 2 or 3 competing cities that are popping up, newly founded around a stream where you can build a textile mill, for instance, a new crossing point on a newly built road or canal. So for that reason, too, you might have local and regional rivalries, and different factions in the same party now hope to get an advantage over each other by giving more people the right to vote, by slowly dropping down the property requirements to minimal amounts of property and eventually getting rid of them altogether. So it's almost as if democracy for the white male working class came to happen by accident, out of the self-interest of aspiring politicians. But nonetheless, the result that the white male adult population had the right to vote by 1830, that changed the character of politics. The catalyst for that was the election of 1824, where you had 4 Democratic Republican presidential candidates. Andrew Jackson won the most votes, 40%, and John Quincy Adams came in second. But the third finisher, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams teamed up because if the Electoral College doesn't produce a 50% plus 1 winner, the president is chosen by the House of Representatives, where each state has 1 vote. So Clay and Adams were insiders in Washington, and they were able to patch together a coalition of their supporters to make Adams the president and Clay the vice president. Excuse me, not the vice president, the Secretary of State. But often that was considered to be the next in line to become president. And the fourth and final finisher was Henry Crawford, who carried no state, who was the official candidate of the Democratic Republican Party, who couldn't be withdrawn in time for the election because he suffered a stroke and was dying as the election took place. So that's why the other 3 jumped in, and then you got this mess. Andrew Jackson was furious and took it personally that he didn't get to be president, so he wanted to try again. And in 1828, he did get himself elected to replace replace John Quincy Adams, who lost his re-election. But the force that backed Jackson and that drove him from this personal sense of slight to becoming the champion of democratic politics was an existing movement of mass membership parties that had been built to include through clubs that meet on a regular basis in local bars and meeting halls, churches too, that organized the working and middle class, the people who had now gotten the right to vote. And out of these clubs arose this new class of professional politicians, people with the working class or middle class background, who learned politics among their peers, who are committed to democracy and to representing the interests of their friends and collaborators in these local clubs, who first go on to form party machines, that is to say, organizations where delegates from these local clubs get together and pick candidates for statewide offices and eventually presidential candidates. So through the mechanism of the political party, the common people now don't just have the right to vote, they have a direct voice in picking the personnel that is going to run the country. In fact, some of them become part of that personnel. And it has to be a professional thing. The people who become politicians and who are not rich from birth, they need to be paid by the party because there is no such thing as legislative per diems. There is no salary for members of Congress. The assumption was, well, whoever is going to end up in Congress will be rich, right? They're going to pay their own way. Well, that means that if the voting population is expanded to include the working and middle class, these are people who will not be able to get elected because they wouldn't be able to afford it. And if you don't want that, then you need to find a mechanism to pay their way. So political parties are that mechanism. The person who more than anyone represents this type of professional politician is Martin Van Buren. He was born in a small town in the state of New York. His father was an innkeeper. He had a bar where local small-time farmers and agricultural laborers assembled and talked politics. So here Van Buren learned to talk the people's politics. And he then went on from what basically was in the bar that his father owned, which was the local club of the Democratic Party in his town of Kinderhook. He went on to become an organization builder, a party builder. He created the statewide Democratic Party in New York, and on that strength was elected governor of the state. He replaced the powerful and rich DeWitt Clinton, who came from one of the old families of the city of New York and who had, as governor, overseen the building of the Erie Canal. So he was a successful governor with lots of support, but not enough to stand up to Van Buren, who was very good at organizing people and getting out the vote. So when Jackson was looking for ways to get into the White House, Van Buren teamed up with him and took his party organizing skills to the national level. He was, in fact, the first professional campaign manager in history, since the United States pioneered this type of democratic mass membership party organization. If you're the first to do it in the US, you are the world's first campaign manager. Van Buren's effort led Jackson to victory in 1828. And Van Buren was rewarded, I want to say, with the vice president's job. And then after Jackson's 2 terms of office were over, Van Buren, that is, was elected as president in 1837. That made him the first person to hold that office who wasn't born rich. So this kind of shows you the importance of this career path. To become a politician, to become a professional politician, means that working class and middle class people have a shot at taking these kinds of offices. So in 1828, when Jackson was elected president, there were 4 major political currents, and this is where we're coming towards the sources you've read in the city of New York, where people are organizing a working class political party, the working men's committees there. There are four major political currents in 1828. The Democratic Republicans are the Jackson people. Their leadership includes the two men I already mentioned, and they appeal to working and middle class voters, these newly enfranchised voters, including many immigrants, most immigrants, who at this point are from Catholic countries like Ireland and Catholic parts of Germany and face hostility in many parts of the country. And so Jackson and his party welcome them and want to integrate them into the society and political system. Jackson fashions himself as a new version of Thomas Jefferson, taking up the cry against banks and economic privilege, becoming the champion of the working class against economic privilege. And that is essentially authentically an expression of what these newly enfranchised working class voters wanted. The National Republicans ran John Quincy Adams as their candidate, who, by the way, is the son of John Adams, in case you hadn't noticed it. So this is kind of a dynasty along the lines of the Bushes or the Clintons. The National Republicans has had as their voters basically the new class of people who profited from the introduction of a market economy: manufacturers, merchants, bankers, large landholders, people who wanted to see the national government follow a Hamiltonian course of economic development, improvement, and support for business. They were Hamiltonians, in other words. What they weren't was comfortable with talking to and asking for the votes of these newly enfranchised white working class voters, and that really was their undoing. If you're looking for a party on the right that didn't have these hang-ups about the working class, the anti-Masons would be that. This is a party that emerges from the new commercial frontier, upstate New York, along the Erie Canal, places that had seen battles with the Iroquois 10 years ago, when now you had factory towns popping up along the locks of the Erie Canal and the intersections of the canal with major roads. Small town ministers and lawyers were really the people who ran the anti-Masonic party. Many of them were ambitious and thwarted in their ambition by well-established ministers and lawyers in big cities. So they talked the politics of resentment. They figured that the common people like them, were being kept away from power by a conspiracy, and that the conspirators who ran the country and who kept them away from power were the Freemasons, that secret society that had been formed in support of the Enlightenment in Europe. And since the Enlightenment contained a pretty strong dose of skepticism about religion, the hostility of the anti-Masons to the Enlightenment and to the Freemasons that carry the torch of the Enlightenment made for an appeal to the evangelical Christians, of which there were many, many more in the 1820s than ever before, because just in the mid-1820s there had been the Second Great Awakening. Many people converted to evangelical Christianity who were either members of other religious groups before or not religious at all. And then also other old school conservatives who joined in. So this anti-Masonic party, the conspiracy-based frontier force that also is Hamiltonian in what they want the government to do, but is distinct from the National Republicans in that they successfully mobilize the people. Finally, the working men's parties. And these are the folks you see when you look at the sources that you're reading here. union members, journeymen, social reformers who work in a kind of grassroots democracy. The flyer says, we're meeting at this place once a week or once a month. If you are with us, come and join us. You get to vote, you get to participate. You might even be elected to office. And they had specific demands that were concrete issues for a working class. They wanted public education. They wanted the abolition of debt imprisonment. They wanted public works to build infrastructure in the cities, very important, to put in sewage canals, because the sanitary conditions in the working class neighborhoods were horrific and bred diseases. And finally, also the right to unionize. In 1828, these working men's parties were not yet at a point where they could have run a presidential candidate. They were existing at the local level, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, the big cities. They were running some statewide candidates even then, but they couldn't have in the presidential election. By 1832, they had been successfully absorbed by the Democrats, so they never fielded a nationwide candidate. But with the addition of the working men's parties, the election of 1832 even expanded beyond 1828 the share of the vote that went for Andrew Jackson. He was elected with a 55% majority. The Whig candidate at that point was Henry Clay. He received 35%, and the remaining 10% went to the anti-Masons. From that point onward, the Whigs courted the anti-Masons with the attempt of forging a new conservative party to challenge the Democrats. The Democrats settled into their role of being the voice, sort of a Frankenstein's monster type creature, both the voice of the white northern working class as well as the defenders of slavery who speak for the southern planters, for the plantation owners. And the winning formula for this awkward and toxic coalition is the notion of a white man's democracy. That within that group of people, the white men in the working class who now have the right to vote, you find the backbone of the republic, and by extension, among everybody else, probably people who are subversive of the republic. So this link between race and class in the North, which is to a big part a function of this political alignment between the white working class in the North and their defenders, the southern planters, is that the defense of slavery becomes a item. Sorry about the interruption. So the defense of slavery becomes the part of the identity of white working class politics in the North, to the point where the one and only time that a worker from the Lower East Side of New York is elected to Congress in 1856, you would have expected him to talk about and use his political position to advocate for the right to unionize, or for public works, or for unemployment benefits, or for health insurance, or any bread and butter issues like these. Instead, he spent his entire career in Congress as a single issue politician, defending slavery and arguing the inferiority of the black race and the right of the white race to be in charge. So it had become such an essential part in defining what a white working class person is, that this seemed to many people to be an adequate representation of their class interest. And we'll revisit this link between class and race when we talk about the Civil War and the draft riots in the city of New York. And of course, if you're watching Gangs of New York, which you really should, that'll also explain a lot of that. Now, the Whig Party remains in its leadership skeptical at best of democracy, but in 1840, they have successfully absorbed the anti-Masons. In many states, the anti-Masons actually now run the party. Pennsylvania and New York, two important ones. They are Hamiltonian, that is to say, in power, they use that power to foster capitalist business. They are also in favor of slavery, but at least they tolerate critics of slavery in their ranks, to indulge some of their religious supporters. But really, their heart is not in that whole democracy business. They have realized that to be competitive, they need to mobilize the masses. But one of the candidates for the Whigs in 1840, who told a friend, "I ain't gonna let no fellow out-democrat me," makes clear that it was a tactical concession on the part of many of these older, even newly recruited conservative politicians. But nonetheless, what you get in the end as a result, starting in 1832, is a stable two-party system. Even as the Whigs take about until 1840 to fully absorb the anti-Masons everywhere, of Democrats versus Whigs. And that remains in place until 1856, when the Republican Party, newly founded by people among the Democrats and the Whigs who are increasingly troubled by the expansion of slavery and the aggressive way in which slaveholders try to gear laws and institutions of the federal government towards that single purpose of defending and extending and expanding slavery. The emergence of that Republican Party, which mixes things up, and then shortly thereafter, of course, the Civil War. So this is the context. What you see when you read the sources for this week is the first stirrings in the world, really, of the working class getting into politics on their own terms, forming parties that are meant to represent them. And that is a distinction that belongs to the United States, to be the birthplace of the labor movement, in that sense, the birthplace of working class political parties. That's that for the lecture this week. I look forward to hearing from the group, and I'll say goodbye.